Kindly take action." In desperation, I called out, but my husband and mother-in-law turned a blind eye. I stood there covered in blood, and they did not even look at me. It appeared that they were more concerned with the cleanliness of the floor than the dangerous dog that had bitten me. I had no choice but to call for an ambulance on my own, and I was transported to the hospital alone. I was unable to stop crying. Eventually, my spouse called me in a panic. He was shouting, "Turn the ambulance around." Brenda Andrews is my name, and I'm 37 years old. 5 years ago, a friend took me to a mixer, a social event for civil servants. Brendan, "You're coming, correct?" she demanded. I met my husband, Scott, who is 5 years younger than me, there. My mother teaches physical education, and my father instructs judo. My 2 older brothers, all black belts in judo, came from a very athletic family. It transformed me into a little tomboy. In contrast, Scott was a completely different person. His shirt buttons didn't match when we first met, and he stammered when making the toast, but he didn't appear to be a bad person. He was a nice guy who just couldn't seem to get things right. Scott's kindness appealed to me and made me feel compassionate. I suggested that we start dating after a few dates. Scott had a knack for calming my naturally irritable mood. Before I knew it, I had come to believe that I should be with him forever. I proposed to him on our first anniversary. I proposed marriage and promised to take care of you for the rest of your life. "That is supposed to be my line, Brenda," he said, tears welling up in his eyes. "I appreciate everything you've done. Let us continue to look out for each other." That is how we decided to tie the knot. Scott was very nervous around my 2 brothers and my strict father when he first met my family. There's no need to be scared. My mother tried to reassure him. However, Scott responded loudly, "Yes." The whole family laughed when he broke into a cracking voice. My father commented that, despite his severity, I could tell he had put a lot of thought into the gifts he brought. But he appears unsure of himself. I'm glad he loves Brenda so much. It's obvious. It was time to meet Scott and his family, after getting to know my own. He told me that 3 years ago, his father died of cancer. Scott was their 6th child, the result of 6 years of infertility struggles. I wasn't the anxious type, normally, but on that particular day, I was especially nervous about seeing his mother. I was so worried about what would happen if she didn't like me. What if I greet her incorrectly? What if our age difference bothers her? At that point, Scott, who is not the most comforting person, said, "Don't worry. My mother is very kind. Speaking with her will come naturally to you. She is well known throughout the community for her constant smile. It helped me a little to hear this. And Brenda, no one can dislike you." He proceeded. His remarks made me happy. We rang the doorbell as soon as we arrived at his family's house. I gave an introduction. "Brenda, it's nice to meet you. You must be Brenda. Thank you very much for taking the time to meet with me today." His mother responded with a warm grin. "Come in. There is no need to be overly formal." She appeared elegant and kind, and she wore a lovely dress. When asked about the age gap, she said it didn't matter at all. Which made me concerned that someone like you would become Scott's wife. This makes me very happy. My worries vanished. She was ecstatic by everything I said and showed no concern about my age difference. I had a blast. We talked about a dog my mother-in-law used to own. "Isn't this adorable?" She indicated a picture. "This dog belonged to me in elementary school. The dog was intelligent and entertaining, but as I grew older, it faded away." My spouse then stated, "Mom, Brenda doesn't really like dogs." "Brenda, don't you like dogs?" she inquired, appearing surprised. I said yes. In reality, despite my slight tomboyish tendencies, I am terrified of dogs. When I was a child playing in the park and went to get the ball from my brother, a scared stray dog bit my arm. My bleeding was severe and required 5 sutures. I've been terrified of dogs since then, and it was a horrible experience. Shirley replied, "Oh my, that was unfamiliar to me. I apologized profusely for raising dogs when you were terrified of them." I quickly replied, No. I apologize if I alarmed you." "The poodle in the photograph was quite cute. Thank you," Shirley replied with a smile. "Your mother is a wonderful person. Such beauty and kindness," I told Scott as we drove home. With a smile, he replied, "I know." My mother has a pleasant demeanor and is constantly smiling. I agreed, saying she's a beautiful mother. We talked a lot about his mother. Then my husband got serious. I actually have something I'd like to talk to you about. He said, "Do you remember how we went to my family home today?" Yes, it was such a large house. I was very surprised. I replied precisely. He continued, "When my father was still alive, he designed it with my mother in mind, making sure everything was convenient for her. The house even has 4 children's bedrooms in case they have more children. But because I am the only child, they were never used. My mother now lives there alone, and she finds it too big and lonely. So I thought, what if we lived with her?" I was taken aback by his unexpected idea. My eyes widened with surprise. It is true. The house was huge, and my mother-in-law kept it spotless. Living in such a home would be incredible. But we are newlyweds, and it feels a little too soon for that. After a moment of reflection, I said, "Your mother is a wonderful person, and the house is beautiful, but it feels too much for me. We just got married, correct? I'd like to enjoy our newlywed life, just the two of us, for a little longer. I see you're correct." "I understand," he replied. "I'll let my mother know." "Yes, I apologize. Please explain to her gently." I felt a little guilty toward Shirley, but I knew it was important to express my true feelings, rather than simply going along with everything. I was relieved when my husband appeared to understand and agree with me. Then our married life began. Scott was still clumsy, but he actively helped with housework, and we were living a happy and smooth life. However, recently something has been bothering me slightly. "Oh, hello, Mom, I get it," Scott said over the phone. "I'm coming over right now." "Is it your mom again?" I asked. "Yeah, the living room light bulb went out. I will go over and replace it. And then you went to his mother's house. This has been going on for a while now. Mom bought a new computer, but she's having trouble setting it up, so I'm going over to help. Mom bought too many groceries at the supermarket and asked me to come pick her up. I am going to help her out." Whether it was weekday or weekend, the phone would ring, and Scott would return to his mother's house more frequently. I began to get upset, thinking that he could at least spend the weekends at home with me. But at the same time, I reminded myself that Scott is simply a kind and thoughtful person who adores his mother. We had been married for a month, and things were going well, just as they had when we were dating. Shirley celebrated her birthday today. My husband and I had chosen a present and a cake for her, and we went to his parents' house. As soon as we stepped in, a frightening dog suddenly jumped out. "What?" I replied, my eyes widening in surprise. I'm afraid of dogs, so there wasn't one when we arrived for the wedding visit. I quickly hid behind my husband. Shirley walked out of the living room and said, "Oh, welcome, Mom." "Where did this scary dog come from?" Scott asked. "Well, I was lonely living alone, so I recently got a dog," she explained, smiling. "The dog was tiny, a Welsh corgi." "I see," I responded, still startled by the dog's unexpected appearance. I forced a smile. You can tell I was scared. Without noticing, my discomfort drew the dog closer to me and said, "Come on, Brenda, why don't you hold it?" I took a step back and said, "I mentioned it when we came for the wedding visit, but I was bitten by a dog when I was younger, and I've been terrified of dogs ever since." I politely declined to hold the dog. "Oh, did you mention that?" "I did not know," she said, pretending not to recall. "But it's really cute. What an unusual person you are." Shirley had a slight smirk on her face, and I wondered for the first time if she was being sarcastic. After that day, Scott would say, "Mom wants to see you," or "Let's go see my mom." I started to decline. I still couldn't get over the smirk she gave me when she noticed I was uncomfortable around the dog. A month later, after finishing work and returning home, I found my mother-in-law in the house. "What? Why are you here?" I asked, surprised. "Oh, welcome home." She greeted me cheerfully, as if everything were fine. She was in the kitchen, opened the fridge, and began cooking. "Why did you come over so suddenly?" I asked. Scott had expressed an interest in my homemade stew, so I knew I had to come. She said, smiling and humming to herself. I see." I tried to smile, but I was tense, especially with her dog in the living room. To make matters worse, she had fed the dog, which appeared clean on my favorite antique plate. I had bought that plate at a flea market in Canada, and now the dog was wondering who would be okay with this. I went into my room to put away my bags and coat. I reminded myself not to be upset because Shirley had come all this way. I took a deep breath to calm myself and returned to the living room. To my horror, the dog had left a mess on the brand new carpet. The stain was bright yellow. Oh no, the dog messed up the carpet. I screamed in terror, but Shirley didn't seem to care. Oh dear, it created a mess right there, she said casually, not bothering to scold or clean up the dog, knowing the stain would worsen if I didn't do something about it. I wound up cleaning it myself. I was normally calm, but this really irritated me. Just then, I heard the door open and my husband entered. When the dog heard him, it started barking loudly. Woof, woof. It barked until he entered the living room, and the sound of the barking terrified me. The dog recognized my husband as soon as he saw him. I felt relieved when it stopped. The three of us sat down to eat the stew Shirley had prepared. My husband and Shirley didn't bother to put the dog in its cage, so it wandered around our feet, hoping for food. I felt tense and began trembling. Shirley noticed and said, "Do you really dislike dogs, Brenda? You look terrified. I brought the dog today to help you overcome your fears. I am bringing the dog here without asking, using my favorite plate, allowing it to mess up the carpet and bark at me. How is all of this supposed to help me overcome my fear? If anything, it made me dislike dogs even more." In my head, I was screaming, "If you truly want to help, simply put the dog in a cage or stay away from me." But my husband didn't notice my discomfort. "Mom is very kind. Brenda, she's really trying to help you," he said. I could not believe it. How is this type? She pretended to care while making matters worse for me. Then, to make matters worse, my husband began lecturing me, "Brenda, this is not okay." "What? I am the one at fault?" I inquired, shocked. "Mom has done everything for you, and yet you still avoid the dog. You will not even visit my parents' house because of the dog. Brenda, you're not trying hard enough." My husband stated that since his mother was present, he began criticizing me more harshly than usual. I had no choice but to express my regret and apologize in front of my mother-in-law. I bit my lip, trying to keep my frustration at bay. Shirley then began to visit us on a regular basis, always accompanied by her dog. Every time, the dog would run around the house, causing a mess. But Shirley never seemed to care about or discipline the dog. These visits were increasingly stressful for me. One day, I had enough. I gathered my courage and said, "Please. I have told you several times that I am afraid of dogs. Can you stop bringing your dog here?" Shirley's expression changed, and she appeared angry. She snapped, "I've been wondering. Is your fear of dogs an excuse for avoiding me? Brenda, that is terrible." I was stunned and had no idea what she meant, but what surprised me even more was my husband's agreement with her. "Brenda, that is too much. My mother has been thinking about you, and you've been avoiding her. That's extremely rude. Apologize to her, Scott. Surely you're both aware that I'm afraid of dogs. But you keep bringing the dog, and each time it causes a mess. I'm responsible for cleaning it up. This is too much." I replied, frustrated. Shirley frowned and said, "Please let me enjoy my time with the dog. You're too old to have children anyway, so what's the harm?" I was stunned. "Is that what you really believe?" I asked. "Isn't it true? You're already 37 years old, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to conceive. But my son is only 32. He has his entire future ahead of him. Now he is stuck with an older, arrogant wife," she muttered. This was the same woman who once told me age was irrelevant. Hearing her true emotions shocked me. I couldn't bear having her around anymore, so I said, "Please do not come here again." My eyes welled up with tears, which may have contributed to Shirley's upset. "How dare you? You really are an arrogant wife," she yelled before storming out with her dog. Since that day, I've been feeling increasingly resentful of both my husband and Shirley. My husband had defended her and blamed me, so things between us had become tense and we barely spoke anymore. 2 weekends later, my husband approached me with a serious expression. "Brenda, I'm sorry," he began. "I was also wrong," Scott said. "I should have thought more about your feelings." I was relieved, thinking he had finally understood how I felt. But then he said, "Let's go apologize to Mom now." What? Why would we do that? Was I wrong that day? I inquired in confusion. It isn't about being right or wrong. Don't make Mom angry. Simply apologize. Please, he said. In the end, my husband couldn't understand anything. He wasn't concerned about my feelings at all. He took me to his parents' home against my will. Shirley was waiting for us with her hands on her hips. "I'm Shirley. I'm sorry about the other day," I said, as my husband had told me to, just to calm her down. But then she said, "I'll forgive you if you hold the dog." That was it. I realized I couldn't reason with her. I had apologized even though I wasn't wrong, and I had tried to meet her halfway many times. And this was her response. "As I've said before, I can't do that," I replied firmly, keeping my cool. Shirley got angry and forcefully pushed the dog toward me. I cried out and instinctively pushed the dog away, but my scream startled the dog and it bit my hand. It hurt so much and my hand was quickly covered in blood. "Please do something." I begged my husband and Shirley, but Shirley just said, "Well, anyone would be scared by such a loud noise." Poor thing. Focusing only on the dog. To my shock, my husband was more concerned about whether the floor was dirty. Neither of them cared about me, and I felt disgusted. Meanwhile, my hand kept bleeding, and I had to shoo the dog away myself. I decided to call an ambulance when the ambulance arrived. Shirley scoffed. "Oh, come on, you're being so dramatic over a dog bite. Looking at me with a mocking expression. My husband, even as the ambulance showed up, didn't change. He was still checking the floor, ignoring both of them. I got into the ambulance, pressing my bleeding hand. I was filled with anger, pain, and sadness. I couldn't stop crying as I sat alone in the ambulance. For some reason, my husband called me while I was being taken to the hospital. I thought maybe he was finally worried about me, so I answered the phone, but instead he said Mom got bitten by the dog. "You're still nearby, right? Tell the driver to come back to our house." Hearing those words, I felt my feelings for my husband start to disappear. I didn't care anymore what happened to him or his mother. Let them deal with it on their own. I quietly hung up the phone. When I got to the hospital and the doctor checked my wound, he said it was deeper than expected and I would need to stay in hospital since I wasn't ready for this. I called my parents and asked them to bring some things for me. After a while, my parents arrived. "Brenda, are you okay?" they asked, their faces full of worry as they looked at me lying in bed. "I'm sorry for making you worry. It still hurts a little, but I'm okay for now," I responded. "I see. When we heard you were taken to the hospital, we were really worried." "What happened?" they asked. I told them everything about how my mother-in-law and husband had acted. My mom hugged me and said, "You did well." I had been feeling so alone, but just being able to talk to them made me feel better. However, my dad was furious after hearing the story. "I will never forgive them," he said angrily. He looked like he was about to explode with rage. The next day, my husband called. Scott was also furious. "What the hell is going on? The police just showed up in our house and now my mom is being questioned. I don't know. Perhaps the hospital reported it. They asked how I got hurt, so I told them your mother's dog bit me." "What? What if my mother gets arrested? It's your fault for being careless in the first place. I figured you would blame me," I replied, "but I don't care anymore. Actually, I have something I've been meaning to tell you. Let's get divorced." "What? We have only been married for 4 months. Getting divorced so quickly? Everyone at work and in our family will laugh at us. It is embarrassing. I am not divorcing you," he said angrily and hung up the phone. 2 weeks later, I was released from the hospital. My parents arrived to pick me up, and I decided to return to their house with them. Following that, I spoke with a lawyer about the divorce and my request for alimony from my husband. There was no way to reason with him. Even though my husband kept calling me, I admired all of his calls. After missing another call, I received a text message from him saying, "I am at the cafe near your parents' house. You'd better come if you truly wanted to talk." He could have visited the house, but he did not. He made it clear that he didn't want to confront my parents unless he had no choice. I went to a cafe. The first thing my husband said was, I quote, "I'm not getting divorced. I care what you want. I am getting divorced. I don't want to stay with you or your mother after what has happened. I responded, "Don't disparage my mother. You are to blame for this." He proceeded to lecture me. "You avoided my mother because you claimed to be afraid of dogs, and the dog bit you after you screamed Dot." At that point, my father and his two brothers arrived at the diner. After I told my father about my husband's message, he invited my brothers to join us. Before we left, 3 bulky judo practitioners encircled him. Scott's voice faltered as he said, "Oh, father-in-law, brothers-in-law." He cowered almost comically. My father interrupted, saying, "How dare you harm my daughter? Our sister desires a separation. Are you going to present it to her?" They all cast ferocious looks at him. Scott stammered in fear and replied, "Yes." It took a lot of convincing from my father and brothers for him to agree to the divorce and pay alimony. "Sign them," I said, passing him the divorce papers I'd already prepared. "We are divorcing each other." My spouse reluctantly signed the documents, and I left the cafe. My father and brothers assisted me in divorcing my spouse and obtaining alimony from him. In addition, I obtained alimony from my ex-mother-in-law. My attorney also sought compensation from her for my injuries. I then learned that the police had questioned my ex-mother-in-law about the dog bite. She had to surrender the dog after receiving a severe warning. It appears that she lavished the dog with so much attention that it began to believe it was more powerful than humans. It bit her after biting me, which caused her wrist to fracture. Her wrist movement is restricted, so she lives an uncomfortable life. My ex-husband and his mother have returned to live with their parents. She'd asked Scott, "Can you help with the laundry? Because she couldn't use her wrist properly. Could you prepare some food for me?" However, Scott was unable to accomplish much on his own because he had never cleaned a house before. My ex-husband blamed her, saying, "It's your fault this happened in the first place," which resulted in their frequent arguments. They began to have frequent arguments. Meanwhile, stories about his mistreatment of me prompted his divorce. According to his family and co-workers, his pride suffered, and it was for the best while I was hospitalized. I was the one who started the rumors. I told his coworker the story and obtained his contact information. I told this coworker on purpose because I knew they liked to gossip. It performed flawlessly. My coworker spread information about my ex-husband's behavior, portraying him as a mama's boy, abusive, and divorced. In all honesty, he deserved it because it made her a prime target at work. I have a wonderful life now that my brothers and parents have supported me,